Jake had been living in his waterfront home for about 3 years when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, and he was getting ready for work when he noticed the envelope stuck to his front door. The HOA logo was printed right there on the front, and he already had a bad feeling about it. He opened it while standing in his driveway, right next to his fishing boat. The letter was short and to the point. They were telling him he had 30 days to remove his boat from the property. If he didn't, they'd start charging him $100 every single day until he complied. Jake read it twice, trying to make sense of it. His boat had been parked in the same spot since the day he moved in. Nobody had ever said a word about it. The boat wasn't even that big. Just a 22-footer that he used for weekend fishing trips. Half the neighborhood had boats. Some people had RVs. Others had work trucks and trailers. His boat wasn't blocking anything or causing problems. It just sat there in his driveway, minding its own business. Jake walked inside and called his neighbor Tom, who lived 3 houses down. Tom had a boat too, actually a bigger one than Jake's. He asked Tom if he'd gotten a letter. Tom hadn't heard anything. That made Jake even more confused and frustrated. Why was he being singled out? That evening, Jake decided to attend the next HOA meeting. He'd never been to one before. He'd always paid his dues on time and followed the rules, so he never had a reason to show up. But this was different. This was his property, and he wanted answers. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse 2 weeks later. About 30 people showed up, which seemed like a decent turnout. Jake sat in the back waiting for his chance to speak. The new HOA president, a woman named Patricia who'd moved into the neighborhood about 8 months ago, ran the meeting. She had this corporate energy about her, like she was running a board meeting instead of a neighborhood gathering. When they opened the floor for residents to speak, Jake raised his hand. He stood up and explained his situation calmly. He told them about the letter, about how his boat had been there for years without issue, and asked why this was suddenly a problem. He even pointed out that other people had boats and recreational vehicles, so why was he being targeted? Patricia didn't even seem sympathetic. She pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws, flipped to a page, and started reading some rule about visible recreational vehicles. The rule said that boats, RVs, and trailers couldn't be visible from the street for more than 48 hours. Jake had never heard of this rule. Apparently it had been in the bylaws for years, but nobody had ever enforced it. Jake asked why they were starting to enforce it now. Patricia gave him this practiced smile and talked about property values and community standards. She said that as the new president, she was committed to making sure everyone followed the rules equally. But Jake knew that wasn't true because he'd driven around the neighborhood before the meeting. There were at least 15 other boats parked in driveways and side yards. He brought this up, and Patricia's smile got tighter. She said they were sending letters to everyone in violation, but Jake would be first since his complaint had been filed first. Jake asked who filed a complaint. She said that information was confidential. The whole thing felt wrong. It felt personal, even though Jake couldn't figure out why anyone would have a problem with him. Other people at the meeting started chiming in. A few boat owners were getting nervous, realizing they might be next. Some people who didn't have boats actually supported Patricia, saying the rules should be enforced. It turned into this whole debate, and by the end of the meeting, nothing was resolved. Patricia made it clear that the 30-day deadline stood. Remove the boat or pay the fines. Jake left that meeting angry but also thinking hard. He drove home the long way, passing by the Marina at the edge of the neighborhood. The Marina had been there forever. His grandfather had actually owned it and run it for decades before passing away. When his grandfather died 10 years ago, Jake inherited it. He'd kept it running mostly out of respect for the old man's memory. The Marina wasn't fancy, just 40 boat slips and a small dock area. Jake rented the slips out to people in the neighborhood at pretty cheap rates. He barely made any profit on it. His grandfather had always kept the prices low for the locals, and Jake had continued that tradition. It was just something his family had always done for the community. As Jake sat in his truck looking at the Marina, something clicked in his head. He'd never really thought about it before, but the Marina wasn't technically part of the HOA. It was his private property. The land had been in his family for generations. There was some old informal agreement that let neighborhood residents have priority access to the slips, but Jake had never looked into the details. His grandfather had set it up based on handshakes and trust. The next morning, Jake called a real estate attorney. He explained the situation with the boat and the HOA, and then asked about the marina. He wanted to know exactly what his rights were regarding that property. The attorney said he'd need to do some research and look at the old documents. A week later, the attorney called back with interesting news. The informal easement agreement that gave the neighborhood access to the marina had actually expired years ago. Nobody had ever renewed it or formalized it into a legal document. That meant the marina was entirely Jake's private property, and he didn't owe the HOA or the residents anything. He could do whatever he wanted with it. Jake sat with this information for a few days. He wasn't the kind of person who liked conflict. He'd always been easygoing and got along with everyone, but something about this whole situation bothered him deeply. The unfairness of it. The way Patricia had dismissed his concerns. The fact that he was being forced to get rid of his boat while others were getting a pass. He thought about his grandfather, who'd been a Navy veteran and a straight shooter. The old man had always said that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, especially when someone's trying to push you around for no good reason. Jake had always remembered that advice, but he'd never really had to use it until now. The 30-day deadline was approaching fast. Jake had looked into boat storage facilities, and they were expensive. The closest one would cost him $200 a month, and it was 30 minutes away. That would make it a huge hassle every time he wanted to use his boat. Plus, it was the principle of the thing. Why should he have to spend money and deal with inconvenience because Patricia decided to enforce some random rule? On day 29, Jake made his decision. He wasn't going to move his boat. He'd pay whatever fines they wanted to charge him, but he was also going to do something else. Something that would make Patricia and the HOA board realize they'd picked the wrong person to mess with. He picked up his phone and called his attorney back. It was time to have a serious conversation about that marina. Tom spent the entire next day digging through boxes in his garage. He was looking for every document related to the marina his grandfather had left him. There were old ledgers, receipts, property surveys, and lease agreements going back decades. The more he read, the more interesting things became. His grandfather, William, had been a fisherman his whole life. Back in the 1970s, he'd bought 2 acres of waterfront property and built a small marina. Nothing elaborate, just 40 boat slips and a simple dock system. For almost 40 years, William ran that marina as a community service more than a business. He charged reasonable rates and took care of his customers like family. When William passed away 10 years ago, Tom inherited everything. He was only 28 at the time and working a regular office job. He didn't know much about running a marina, but the business practically ran itself. The same families had been renting slips for years. They paid their fees on time, took care of their boats, and rarely needed anything from Tom, so he just kept things going the way his grandfather had. What Tom discovered as he read through the old papers was fascinating. His grandfather had always maintained that the marina was completely separate from Harborside Estates, even though the properties shared a border. Back in the 80s, when the housing development was first built, there had been some kind of informal agreement. The developer wanted to advertise the community as having marina access, and William agreed to give residents priority for slip rentals. But Tom couldn't find any legal document that formalized this arrangement. No easement, no right-of-way, nothing in writing that gave the HOA or its residents any legal claim to the marina. It had all been based on handshakes and good faith. His grandfather had simply been a nice guy who wanted to help his neighbors. Tom made an appointment with a real estate attorney for the following Monday. Her name was Linda Chen, and she came highly recommended. When Tom sat down in her office and explained the situation, she listened carefully while taking notes. "Let me make sure I understand," Linda said when he finished. "You own a private marina. The HOA residents have been using it for years, but there's no legal agreement giving them access rights?" "That's correct," Tom confirmed. "My grandfather had an informal arrangement with the original developer, but I can't find anything legally binding." Linda spent the next hour reviewing all the documents Tom had brought. She examined the property deed, checked for any recorded easements, and looked through the old correspondence between William and the development company. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "This is pretty straightforward," she said. "The marina is your private property. There are no easements, no access agreements, nothing that would give the HOA or its residents any legal right to use your facility. The fact that your grandfather allowed them access doesn't create any permanent obligation on your part." Tom felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a kind of weight. This wasn't just about legal rights anymore. These were his neighbors, people he saw at the grocery store and waved to on the street. So theoretically, Tom said slowly, I could close the marina to HOA residents if I wanted to. Theoretically? Linda smiled slightly. Not just theoretically. Legally, you could close it to everyone. It's private property. You could turn it into a parking lot if you wanted. Tom thanked her and paid for the consultation. On the drive home, his phone rang. It was the HOA office. The 30-day deadline had passed and Tom hadn't moved his boat. Starting tomorrow, he would be fined $100 per day. When Tom got home, he sat at his kitchen table with a beer and really thought about what he wanted to do. Part of him just wanted to avoid the whole mess. He could move his boat to a storage facility, pay the monthly fees, and forget about it. That would be the easy path, but something about the situation really bothered him. Patricia Morris hadn't just enforced a rule. She'd been rude and dismissive. She'd refused to even consider any kind of compromise or grandfather clause for people who'd been parking boats for years. She'd wielded her little bit of power like a weapon, and Tom wasn't the only person she'd targeted. He'd heard stories about other violations she was pursuing, other neighbors she was making miserable. The next morning, Tom drove over to the marina. It was early, around 7 in the morning, and only a few boat owners were there. Old Pete was hosing down his fishing boat, getting ready for a day on the water. The Williams couple was loading coolers onto their yacht. Everyone waved to Tom as he walked down the dock. He spent an hour just walking around, looking at everything. The marina wasn't fancy, but it was well maintained. The docks were solid, the electrical hookups worked properly, and there was plenty of parking. His grandfather had taken pride in keeping things nice, and Tom had continued that tradition. Tom pulled out his phone and started making a list of all the current slip renters. 40 slips total. He counted 31 that were rented to people living in harborside estates. That was more than 3/4 of his business, all coming from the same HOA that was now fining him for parking his own boat on his own property. The irony wasn't lost on him. Over the next week, Tom did more research. He looked up what other marinas in the area charged for slip rentals. It turned out his rates were incredibly low. He was charging about 60% of market value. Over the course of a year, he was basically giving away thousands of dollars in potential revenue. He'd done this because his grandfather had, and because these were his neighbors. But now one of those neighbors was fining him $100 a day. The first fine notice arrived on Wednesday, then another on Thursday. By Friday, he owed $500. Tom made another appointment with Linda Chen. This time he had a specific plan in mind, and he wanted to make sure it was legal. Linda listened carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, and then nodded. You're absolutely within your rights to do this, she said. The marina is your private property. You can terminate leases with proper notice, which according to the agreements you showed me is 30 days. You can close the facility for any reason or no reason at all. And if they try to fight it? Tom asked. They have no grounds, Linda assured him. You're not discriminating based on any protected class. You're simply closing your private business. If anything, they should be grateful you've been charging below market rates all these years. Tom spent the weekend thinking it over one more time. This was going to make a lot of people angry. Some of those people were his friends. The Johnsons, who lived 3 doors down, kept their boat at his marina. So did the Lee family, whose kids he'd watched grow up. This wasn't just about Patricia Morris anymore. This was about the whole community. But then he thought about Patricia's face at that board meeting, the dismissive way she'd shut down every point he made, the complete unwillingness to show any flexibility or understanding. She'd made it clear that rules were more important than people, that property values mattered more than community spirit. Fine, Tom thought. If that's how she wants to play it, let's see how she likes it when someone else plays by the exact same rules. On Monday morning, Tom drafted a letter. He kept it professional and straightforward. Due to personal reasons, the marina would be closing temporarily for renovations and improvements. All current leases would be terminated in 30 days. Security deposits would be refunded in full. He thanked everyone for their business and apologized for any inconvenience. He printed out 31 copies and drove to the marina. One by one, he placed the letters on the windshields of every car belonging to a Harborside Estates resident. Then he went home and waited for the storm to hit. The first phone call came at 8:30 that morning, then another at 8:45. By 9 o'clock, Tom's phone was ringing constantly. He let most of the calls go to voicemail. The messages ranged from confused to angry to downright panicked. "Tom, it's Bill Johnson. I just found a letter on my car about the Marina closing. Is this some kind of joke? Call me back. This is Rebecca Lee. I don't understand what's happening. We've had our slip for 12 years. Please call us." "Tom, this is completely unacceptable. You can't just kick everyone out with 30 days' notice. We'll be talking to our lawyers about this." That last one made Tom smile a little. Good luck with that, he thought. Linda had been very clear about his rights. By noon, someone from the HOA office called. It wasn't Patricia Morris, but one of the board members, a guy named Frank who Tom had seen at the meeting. Frank tried to sound friendly and reasonable. "Tom, hey, listen. There seems to be some confusion about the Marina situation. A lot of residents are pretty upset. Can we talk about this?" "I sent out letters explaining the situation," Tom said calmly. "The Marina is closing for renovations. Everyone has 30 days to remove their boats." "Right, but Tom, you have to understand, a lot of these people have nowhere else to put their boats. The other marinas in the area have waiting lists. Some people have been keeping their boats there for over a decade." "I understand that," Tom said. "It's unfortunate timing." There was a pause on the other end. "Is this about the boat parking thing? Because if it is, maybe we can work something out." "I'm not sure what you mean," Tom said innocently. "I'm just doing some renovations. It's been 10 years since my grandfather passed and the place needs some updates. Frank wasn't buying it." "Tom, come on. This is pretty clearly retaliation for the parking violation. That's not how we solve problems in this community." Tom felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "You know what else isn't how we solve problems? Fining someone $100 a day for parking their boat in their own driveway, after 3 years of it not being an issue. But here we are." "Look," Frank said, "let me talk to Patricia. Maybe we can come to some kind of agreement." "The 30-day notice stands," Tom said. "If people have concerns, they're welcome to discuss it with me after they've moved their boats." He hung up before Frank could respond. His hands were shaking a little. This was really happening. He was really doing this. That afternoon, Tom drove to the marina to check on things. There were at least a dozen people there, standing around in small groups, talking animatedly. When they saw Tom's truck pull up, several of them walked over. "Tom, what's going on?" one woman asked. She looked genuinely distressed. "I've had my boat here since your grandfather ran the place." "I'm sorry," Tom said, and he meant it. "I need to close the marina for a while to make some improvements." "What kind of improvements?" someone else demanded. "The place is fine the way it is." Tom just shook his head. "That's my decision to make. It's my property." "Is this because of Patricia and the boat thing?" the first woman asked. "Because most of us think that whole situation is ridiculous. We had nothing to do with it." Tom looked at her. "Then maybe you should be having this conversation with your HOA board instead of me." He got back in his truck and drove away, ignoring the shouts behind him. His heart was pounding. He didn't enjoy being confrontational, but he wasn't backing down either. The real escalation came 2 days later. Tom was at work when he got an email from Patricia Morris herself. The subject line read, "Marina closure, legal action pending." The email was curt and threatening. Patricia claimed that the marina closure was clearly retaliation for legitimate HOA enforcement. She stated that the HOA would be pursuing legal remedies to force the marina to remain open, and that Tom could be sued for damages by affected residents. She demanded that he rescind the closure notice immediately. Tom forwarded the email to Linda Chen and asked her to respond on his behalf. An hour later, Linda called him. "I sent a response," she said, and Tom could hear the amusement in her voice. Basically told her to pound sand in the nicest legal language possible. "Tom, they have absolutely no case. This is an empty threat." "You're sure?" Tom asked. "Positive. The marina is private property. You have no obligation to keep it open. If they want to sue you, they're welcome to waste their money on legal fees, but no judge is going to force you to run a business you don't want to run." Tom felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "Thanks, Linda." That evening, another HOA board member called. This time it was a woman named Dorothy who Tom actually liked. She'd always been friendly at neighborhood gatherings, and she seemed like one of the more reasonable board members. "Tom," she said gently, "I want you to know that not everyone on the board agrees with how Patricia handled your situation. Some of us think the boat parking enforcement was too aggressive. Then why didn't anyone say something at the meeting? Tom asked. Dorothy sighed. Patricia can be intimidating. She's very forceful about what she thinks is right. But Tom, closing the marina is hurting a lot of innocent people who had nothing to do with your violation notice. I'm aware of that, Tom said, but it's my property and I can do what I want with it. I understand that legally you're within your rights, Dorothy said. But is this really the kind of neighbor you want to be? Is this what your grandfather would have wanted? That hit Tom hard. His grandfather had been all about community and helping people. He'd run the marina at a loss half the time just because he enjoyed giving people access to the water. Would he be disappointed in Tom right now? Tom thought about it for a moment. Then he remembered sitting at that board meeting, trying to explain his situation and having Patricia shut him down without a hint of empathy or willingness to compromise. You know what, Dorothy? Tom said. My grandfather also taught me not to let people walk all over me. He taught me that respect goes both ways. Your HOA president has shown me zero respect, and now she's threatening to sue me for exercising my property rights. So no, I'm not backing down. What would it take? Dorothy asked quietly. To reopen the marina? Patricia needs to rescind the boat parking violation and drop all the fines, Tom said immediately. And the HOA needs to officially amend the bylaws to allow boats in driveways. If you want access to my private marina, then I want to be able to use my own property the way I've been using it for 3 years. I'll talk to the board, Dorothy said. You do that, Tom replied. The next day, Tom received his second week of fines. He now owed the HOA $1,400. He wrote a check without hesitation and dropped it in the mail. He could afford it and he wanted to make a point. He wasn't trying to dodge the fines. He was challenging the entire premise of the rule. Meanwhile, the situation in the community was getting tense. Tom started noticing people glaring at him when he drove through the neighborhood. Someone left an angry note on his windshield calling him petty and vindictive. A couple of his neighbors who he'd considered friends stopped waving when they saw him. But he also heard through the grapevine that Patricia was facing serious heat. People were furious with her. There were rumors of a special election to remove her from the board. Arguments were breaking out at neighborhood gatherings about whose fault this whole mess really was. Tom went to the marina one last time before the 30 days were up. He'd hired a fencing company, and they were starting work the next morning. He stood on the dock looking out at the water and thought about his grandfather. About all the hours William had spent here, helping people with their boats, sharing fishing stories, being part of something bigger than himself. I'm sorry, Grandpa, Tom said quietly, but sometimes you have to fight back. The next morning, the construction crew arrived at 6 a.m. By noon, they'd started putting up posts. By the end of the week, there was a 6-foot chain-link fence surrounding the entire marina property. With a locked gate at the entrance and private property, no trespassing signs posted every 20 feet. The marina was officially closed. 2 more weeks passed and Jake still hadn't reopened the marina. The boat parking rule was officially suspended, and he'd received a check from the HOA for $6,000, covering all the fines they'd charged him. He'd deposited the check and kept a copy of everything for his records. But the marina gates remained locked. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Boat owners were still calling him regularly, some polite and some not so much. A few had gotten aggressive, threatening to sue him or cause problems. Jake's attorney had handled those calls, sending cease and desist letters to anyone who crossed the line into harassment or threats. Most people backed off after that. The petition to recall Patricia was gaining momentum. Tom had told Jake that they'd already collected over 100 signatures, which was more than enough to force a special election under the HOA bylaws. Patricia was trying to fight it, claiming the petition was invalid for various technical reasons, but she was clearly rattled. Her power base was crumbling. Jake had been thinking a lot about his grandfather during this time. He'd gone through some of the old man's things stored in his attic, looking at old photos and documents from when his grandfather ran the marina. There were pictures from the grand opening back in the 70s, showing his grandfather shaking hands with the mayor at the time. The marina had been a real source of pride for the old man. In one box, Jake found an old ledger where his grandfather had kept track of the slip rentals by hand. The entries went back decades. What struck Jake was how many times his grandfather had written paid next to people's names even when they'd fallen behind on rent. There were notes in the margins like going, through hard times, or medical bills, or just good people. His grandfather had run the marina as much as a community service as a business. Jake realized he'd been doing the same thing, keeping the rates low and being flexible with people, but that generosity had been taken for granted. Nobody had appreciated it until it was gone. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He'd been trying to honor his grandfather's legacy, and it had gotten him exactly nowhere. Maybe it was time for a different approach. He called his attorney and told him he'd decided to reopen the marina, but with new terms. The attorney helped him draft a proper commercial lease agreement, the kind that would hold up in court and protect Jake's interests. The new terms included market rate pricing, which was about 3 times what Jake had been charging. It also included strict rules about late payments, proper insurance requirements, and clear termination clauses. The attorney also drafted a new access agreement with the HOA. This document formally acknowledged that the marina was Jake's private property and that any access granted to residents was a privilege, not a right. The agreement could be terminated by Jake at any time with proper notice. It also included a clause that if the HOA took any action against Jake related to his boat or his property that was found to be retaliatory or discriminatory, the access agreement would automatically terminate. Jake approved everything and had his attorney send copies to the HOA board and to all the former slip renters. The response was immediate and mixed. Some people were just happy to have their boats back and didn't care about the new rates. Others were angry about the price increase, complaining that Jake was gouging them. A few people accused him of being greedy and taking advantage of the situation. Jake didn't respond to the complaints. He'd made his decision and it was take it or leave it. The new rates were actually below market value compared to other marinas in the area. If people didn't like it, they were free to go elsewhere. He'd learned the hard way that being too generous just made people entitled. The HOA board met to review the access agreement. According to Tom, who continued to attend all the meetings and report back, there was a lot of debate. Patricia was against signing it, claiming the terms were unfair and that Jake was basically holding the neighborhood hostage. But Richard and the other board members who'd supported suspending the boat rule argued that Jake was being more than reasonable. He was under no obligation to provide marina access at all. The board voted to accept the agreement 4-3 again. Patricia was clearly the losing side of every vote now. Jake signed the agreement when it came back to him, and just like that, the legal framework was in place. The marina could reopen. Before he did, though, Jake made one more decision. He hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations of the marina. He'd been managing it himself all these years, dealing with tenants directly, handling maintenance, collecting rent. It had been a constant source of stress and work. The management company would handle all of that for a fee, and Jake would just be the owner. It was more professional and would help keep things at arm's length. On a Monday morning, exactly 3 months after he'd first locked the gates, Jake reopened the marina. The management company had sent out welcome packets to all the new tenants, explaining the rules and providing the gate access codes. By noon, people were moving their boats back in. Jake watched from a distance, sitting in his truck at the top of the hill overlooking the marina. He saw Tom pulling his boat in, and Tom spotted Jake's truck. He drove up and got out to chat. Tom thanked Jake for reopening and said he understood why the rates had to go up. He also mentioned that most of the boat owners, despite their initial complaints, were happy to have their boats back in a convenient location. The alternatives had been worse. Tom also shared some neighborhood gossip. The recall election was officially happening in 2 weeks. Patricia had tried everything to stop it, but the petition was valid and there were enough signatures. 3 people had announced they were running to replace her, including Richard. Tom said Richard would probably win easily since he'd been the voice of reason throughout the whole crisis. Jake asked if Patricia had said anything about him lately. Tom laughed and said she'd gone radio silent. She wasn't attending many neighborhood functions anymore, and when she did, she kept to herself. The humiliation of how everything had played out had clearly gotten to her. Tom said some people almost felt sorry for her, but most people felt she'd brought it on herself by being so rigid and power-hungry. The next 2 weeks were relatively quiet. Jake went about his normal life, working his regular job and enjoying his evenings. His boat remained in his driveway, right where it had been all along. Nobody said a word about it. The marina was running smoothly under professional management, and Jake was finally making a decent profit from it instead of just breaking even. The recall election happened on a Saturday. Voting took place at the community center, and Tom texted Jake updates throughout the day. Turnout was high, with over 200 residents casting ballots. By evening, the results were in. Patricia had been voted out by a landslide margin. Richard won the presidency with 60% of the vote. The other two candidates split the remaining votes. Jake didn't celebrate or gloat. He just felt relieved that this chapter was finally closing. That evening, he was working in his garage when he saw someone walking up his driveway. He was surprised to see it was Patricia. She looked different than usual, less put together. Her confident corporate demeanor was gone. She asked if they could talk for a minute. Jake was cautious but agreed. They stood in his driveway, and Patricia did something Jake never expected. She apologized. She said she'd let the power of being HOA president go to her head. She admitted that she'd been wrong to single him out about the boat, and that she'd been too stubborn to back down when she should have. She said the whole experience had been humbling, and that she'd learned some hard lessons about community and leadership. Jake didn't know what to say at first. He'd imagined this moment many times, and in his head, he'd always had some perfect speech prepared. But standing there in the moment, all that came out was a simple, "Thanks for saying that." Patricia nodded and said she hoped they could eventually be civil neighbors, even if they'd never be friends. Jake said he could live with that. After she left, Jake stood in his driveway for a while thinking. The whole situation could have been avoided if Patricia had just been willing to listen and compromise from the start. But sometimes people need to lose something before they learn to appreciate what they have. That was true for Patricia, and in some ways it was true for the neighborhood too. The community had taken the marina for granted for years. They'd benefited from Jake's grandfather's generosity, and then Jake's continuation of it, without ever really acknowledging it or protecting it. Now they were paying market rates and dealing with professional management instead of a friendly neighbor who cut them slack. That was the cost of not valuing what you have while you have it. Tom stopped by later that evening with a six-pack. They sat on Jake's back porch looking out at the water. Tom said Richard had already reached out to Jake through the HOA, expressing hope that they could have a better working relationship going forward. Tom also mentioned that several people had told him they wished they'd spoken up sooner when Patricia was going after Jake. They'd been afraid to challenge the HOA president, and now they regretted staying silent. Jake took a long drink and said that was probably the most important lesson in this whole thing. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you need to spew. 6 months had passed since the whole ordeal ended, and life in the neighborhood had settled into a new normal. Jake's boat still sat proudly in his driveway, a quiet symbol of standing up for yourself when someone tries to push you around. Every time he looked at it, he felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with fishing. The marina was thriving under professional management. The property management company sent Jake monthly reports showing strong occupancy rates and steady income. He was making more money from it now than he ever had, and he wasn't dealing with any of the headaches. All the slips were rented, some to original tenants who'd accepted the new rates, others to new people from outside the neighborhood who appreciated having access to quality waterfront docking. Richard had turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He'd reached out to Jake early in his term, and they'd had a good conversation about working together for the community's benefit. Richard understood that the HOA's job was to maintain common areas and handle necessary business, not to micromanage how people lived in their own homes. He'd started reviewing other outdated or overly restrictive rules in the bylaws, getting input from residents before making changes. One of Richard's first actions had been to formally rewrite the boat and recreational vehicle rules. The new version was reasonable and clear. Boats and RVs could be stored on private property, as long as they were maintained in good condition and not blocking sidewalks or streets. It was common sense stuff that most people could live with. The vote to approve the new rules had been nearly unanimous. Patricia had kept a low profile after losing the election. She still lived in the neighborhood, but she wasn't involved in HOA business anymore. Jake saw her occasionally at the grocery store or driving past his house. They'd nod politely to each other, but never stop to chat. That was fine with both of them. The apology she'd offered had been enough to clear the air, but they'd never be friends. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, and that's okay. Tom remained Jake's closest friend in the neighborhood. They went fishing together most weekends, sometimes taking Tom's boat and sometimes taking Jake's. They'd laugh about the whole Marina situation now, though at the time it hadn't been funny at all. Tom often said that Jake had done the neighborhood a favor by standing up to Patricia. He'd shown everyone that the HOA couldn't just run over people's rights without consequences. The story of Jake's standoff with the HOA had become somewhat legendary in the area. People in neighboring communities had heard about it, and Jake occasionally got recognized at local businesses. More than once, someone had come up to him and said they wished they had the courage to stand up to their own HOA. Jake always told them the same thing. Know your rights, document everything, and don't back down when you know you're right. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. The local news had done a follow-up story about 6 months after the original piece aired. They'd interviewed Richard and several residents about how the community had changed since the controversy. Most people admitted that it had been a wake-up call. They'd learned to be more involved in HOA decisions and to speak up when they saw unfair treatment. Voter turnout at HOA meetings had tripled, and people actually read the bylaws now before voting on changes. The reporter had also interviewed Jake again. She'd asked if he had any regrets about how he'd handled the situation. Jake had thought about it for a moment before answering. He said he wished it hadn't been necessary to close the marina and cause problems for innocent boat owners. But he didn't regret standing up for himself. Sometimes you have to make people uncomfortable before they'll listen and change. One unexpected benefit of the whole situation was that property values in the neighborhood had actually gone up. The controversy had brought attention to the area, and the improvements Richard had made to HOA governance had made it more attractive to potential buyers. Real estate agents were using the story as a selling point, talking about how the community had strong property rights protections and reasonable HOA management. It was ironic considering Patricia had been so worried about property values. The marina itself had also improved significantly. With the higher income from the new rates, Jake had been able to invest in upgrades. The management company had overseen the installation of better lighting, security cameras, and improved dock facilities. Some of the original tenants who'd complained about the price increases had to admit that the marina was in better shape now than it had ever been. You get what you pay for, and people were starting to appreciate that. Jake had also used some of the marina profits to upgrade his own boat. He'd added new fishing equipment and a better sound system. He'd even had it professionally detailed so it looked brand new. If his boat was going to sit in his driveway as a symbol of his victory, he figured it should look good doing it. Some neighbors had complimented him on it, and he always smiled and thanked them. His relationship with the broader community had actually improved over time. Initially, some people had been angry with him for closing the marina and causing problems. But as the dust settled and people understood the full story, most of them came around. They realized he'd been treated unfairly and had only defended himself. Several people had apologized for not supporting him earlier or for giving him a hard time. The experience had taught Jake some valuable lessons about human nature. People often don't appreciate what they have until it's gone. They take generosity for granted and only recognize its value when it's withdrawn. The neighbors had benefited from his grandfather's kindness, and then his own for years without thinking twice about it. Only when the marina closed did they realize how good they'd had it. He'd also learned that sometimes you have to be willing to fight for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. If he'd just backed down and moved his boat, Patricia would have continued to abuse her power and target other residents. By standing firm, he'd not only protected himself but also created change that benefited everyone. Sometimes one person's courage can spark a movement. Tom had told Jake about a conversation he'd overheard at a neighborhood barbecue. A group of newer residents were talking about the HOA, and one person had asked if the board ever overstepped their authority. Someone else had laughed and told them the story of Jake and the marina. They'd finished by saying that the current board was really careful not to abuse their power, because they'd seen what happened when someone pushed back. Jake's stand had created a lasting legacy of accountability. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Jake was working on his boat in the driveway when a car pulled up. A man about Jake's age got out and introduced himself. He said he lived in a neighborhood about 20 miles away and had heard about Jake's story. His own HOA was trying to force him to remove a work trailer from his property, even though it was essential for his business. He wanted advice on how to handle it. Jake invited him to sit on the porch, and they talked for over an hour. Jake shared everything he'd learned: the importance of understanding property rights, documenting everything, getting a good attorney, and being prepared to stand firm. He told the man about the emotional toll it had taken and warned him that it wouldn't be easy. But he also said that if the man knew he was right, it would be worth it to fight. The man thanked Jake and said he felt more confident about standing up to his HOA. As he was leaving, he turned back and said something that stuck with Jake. He said that what Jake had done mattered beyond just his own neighborhood. He'd shown people everywhere that they didn't have to accept unfair treatment from HOAs or any other authority. He'd reminded people that they had power too if they were willing to use it. After the man left, Jake sat on his porch for a while, thinking about how far things had come. 6 months ago, he'd been stressed out and angry, paying fines and dealing with a locked marina. Now he was at peace. His boat was where it belonged. The marina was profitable, and he'd become an accidental advocate for standing up to HOA overreach. His grandfather would have gotten a kick out of the whole thing. The old man had always had a rebellious streak hidden under his friendly exterior. He'd served in the Navy, fought in a war, and then came home to build a life on his own terms. He'd taught Jake that respect has to be earned and that authority without wisdom is just tyranny. Those lessons had served Jake well during the conflict. Jake thought about all the people who'd been involved in the story. Patricia, who'd learned the hard way that power without empathy leads to downfall. Richard, who'd shown that leadership could be fair and effective. Tom and the other neighbors who'd learned to speak up and stay engaged. The boat owners who'd learned not to take things for granted. And himself, who'd learned that standing up for yourself could be hard but was always worth it. The sun was setting over the water, casting orange and pink light across the sky. Jake could see the marina in the distance, boats bobbing gently in their slips. Everything had worked out in the end, though it had taken time and struggle to get there. The neighborhood was better for what had happened, even if it hadn't felt that way at the time. Sometimes growth comes through conflict, and sometimes the hardest battles lead to the best outcomes. Jake stood up and walked over to his boat. He ran his hand along the hull, feeling the smooth fiberglass.